Both of their works have had wide influence in the social and behavioral sciences beyond sociology. I'm going to introduce them in the order that which they will be speaking at first. First, I'd like to introduce Glen Elder, who I've always thought of as the father of life course theory in sociology. He's a former professor of Cornell of Sociology and Human Development from 1979 to 1984. And we like to think that those were very influential years in his development, especially in life course theory and his association with the late and beloved Yuri Bronfenbrenner. Professor Elder is currently the Howard W. Odom Research Professor of Sociology, a Research Professor of Psychology, and a current professor at the Carolina Population Center, which is known for its research on life course and demography. His major seminal work was Children of the Great Depression, Social Changes in Life Experience, and that's been followed up with many other works, and more recently this work, but also a work on families recovering from the Iowa floods of about 2 decades ago. He's received many major accolades, including membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Cooley and Mead Award by the Social Psychology section of the American Sociological Association. And here I am stuttering like I threatened I would do. A second, I'd like to introduce Rick Settersten. He is the head of the School of Social and Behavioral Health Sciences at Oregon State University, a university distinguished professor and the Barbara E. Knudsen Endowed Chair in Human Development and Family Sciences there. He's the founding director of the Hallie Ford Center for Healthy Children and Families, and was a decade-long member of the MacArthur Research Network on Transitions to Adulthood and Public Policy. He's won the Distinguished Lifetime Career Award for the Society for the Study of Human Development for his works. He's done wide work as well in life course theory, including work on military lives and also on economic precarity in the lives of families, all of which are relevant today. So I'd like to turn it over first to Professor Glen Elder to introduce our panel.
I wanted to begin by saying, greetings, Cornell, because those years were wonderful. And I promised Yuri that they would continue beyond Cornell, and they have for many years. Our story began some time ago with the completion of Children of the Great Depression at the Berkeley Institute of Human Development. I had followed an Oakland cohort, which was born in 1920-21 into middle age, but had very little information on the parents. To fill this gap, I turned to the Institute's Berkeley study and discovered an amazing feature. The parents and the study child were followed across their years. And this rare design enabled me to launch a study of the parent generation into old age. With my eye on a book project, I came up with an outline and began working on chapters in 1973. This continued one chapter after another into the next century. By 2010, I realized that I was not getting any younger, and I needed collaborators to finish this work, to move the drafts into chapters of a book. I turned to Rick and Lisa to assist me and was ecstatic when they agreed to do so, to join this enterprise. I looked forward to Rick's insight on the life course and aging, and to Lisa's special expertise on gender and the family in the 20th century. We've had many peak experiences across this past decade, but one that stands out especially is a 2-day workshop at the annual summer sociology meeting in Denver in 2012. We came together to review all chapter drafts and to outline the book. Some chapters were added and some chapters were deleted, but the entire time was very stimulating and a great beginning for our collaboration across the years. And I turn it over to Rick.
Thanks, Glenn. I didn't want to interrupt your comments, so I'm going to share my screen now if everyone will be patient for a moment. And let me figure out how to do this. Okay, can everyone see the slide? Elaine, can you see the slide?
I can see the slide, yes.
Excellent. Okay.
Very good.
Thanks. Well, thank you to Janice, Elaine, and Anthony, and Sarah, and Paula, and everyone else who played a role in making today's session possible. We've been really excited about being here, and I know Glenn especially felt that this would be a kind of homecoming, a virtual homecoming for him. So Glenn just made a few comments about how the book came about, its early origins, and I'd like to, I would have shown you these photos when he was speaking, of course, really having its origin in children of the Great Depression and some of the really profound ideas that sort of came out of that and out of so much of Glenn's subsequent work. And Glenn mentioned that pivotal meeting in 2012 at ASA, and I had the thought to quickly take a few photos on a pretty crummy phone at that time, but you can see the three of us happily together and our mad writings on the whiteboard behind us. We're glad we have those couple of photos that captured that moment, because I think it was, as Glenn said, really a peak experience for all of us, and this has been such a remarkable journey for all three of us. Yeah, it reminded me too often, I mean, we have prolific collaborations, all of us, with other people, and we don't document it. And we should know better, having spent so much time in archives. But in any case, that sort of brings to life the story that Glenn was telling. I'd like to just make a couple of comments about why we see the book as significant. And by the way, then I think the plan will be that we're going to have an open, free-flowing discussion with Elaine for a while, and then open it up for questions. So if you've got questions, please do log them in the Q&A, and we'll be ready to handle those later. So a couple of points about why we see the book as important. The first is really that it addresses this big theme of how a rapidly changing world affects human lives, how it leaves people feeling unsettled and disoriented, how it demands that they adapt to and cope with change, how it alters their lives in ways that are often unforeseen and often profound. And this seems so pertinent in our own era of accelerating discord and change. And that's something I think we can return to at the end. This is a book that's also going to capture a rarely studied generation. This is what we're going to call the 1900 generation. And it's a generation that for us is special because as they grow up and older, they're going to encounter a century of revolutionary change, as Robert Gordon calls it. Their lives are going to be marked by migration, by wartime, by great swings in the economy, both upward and downward, and by unimaginable inventions and advances in science and technology. As one person associated with the study said in the 1980s, we love this quote, "Never again will history equal the rate of change of this period, from covered wagons to the moon." And just gives you a sense of just the scope of what this generation saw in the course of their lifetimes. They're going to become important to us because we see them as what Leonard Kane called a hinge generation. And that is, they're going to be a hinge between the past and the present. Their lives are going to be dramatically different from the generations that came before them, really distinct. But they're also going to confront and instigate a set of changes that are going to echo through the rest of the century. They're going to become a hinge generation in a number of ways, and we can entertain any of these points in the discussion. It's going to be true in some of the really remarkable changes in the nature of work, in the growing separation of workplaces from homes, in the expansion of higher education, in increasing labor force participation of married women, the greater egalitarianism that's going to come to their marriages, and also some really, in a way, this is a generation that's going to be at the forefront of a cultural turn in how they go about the business of parenting. And hopefully we'll come back to that later. But in any case, what's so interesting for us is that we're able with this study to trace people's lives over the long arc of their lives. But as we do, we're able to really understand how their lives intersect with some major periods of social change and disruption. It's also going to be special because this is a study of families. And so we can also look at some of the action that occurs across generations in families. As Gunhild Hagestad once said, families are also gathering places in which generations make sense of history, that they explore their similarities and differences within the context of family life. So it is a kind of, the Berkeley study is a path-breaking lifelong study that's going to allow us to examine those things. It's also going to allow us to challenge some conventional wisdom. There are going to be some surprises here for us. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that so much of what we take for granted about the life course today, we assume emerged in the wake of World War II. And for sure, that is going to be a really critical turning point. But science also relies so heavily on data gathered in the second half of the last century that this study is going to be important because we're going to be able to see firsthand what was actually happening in the lives of these people and these families. And we're going to see that that sometimes we've made erroneous assumptions about what life was like in the past, based on the special look we're going to be able to get into these families in the first half of the century. So let me just quickly make a few comments about the archives. That's Jean McFarland up there in the right-hand corner. Glenn, do you actually want to say a couple of words about Jean?
Yeah. She was such a remarkable person. I was at the Institute from 1962 to for about 6-7 years, and I really got to know Jean McFarland, not just then, but over the years. I would keep going back to the Institute, and Jean became more remarkable the more I knew more about her. She was a person who was a pathbreaker in clinical psychology and at Berkeley, and she was the second woman to get her PhD there. And she established this longitudinal study at a time when longitudinal studies were so rare, so unusual. Can you imagine trying to get funding for something like this with no government funding at all, and no appreciation really of the longitudinal studies? They were just coming into their own. And so she was a pathbreaker there, in addition to the fact that she decided she would follow both the parents and the child, the study child, across time, because she was really interested in the intergenerational relationship, the bringing up of children. And that's why her original study was called the Berkeley Guidance Study. She really had an interest in the way in which parents who are educated and informed on how to bring up children make a difference in their children. And that kind of went by the wayside as history just rewrote the script for her study. But she was a long-term longitudinal advocate, and she followed these people. She was still going strong when I saw her in the 60s and 70s. She lived in, she was born in 1894. So she's a member of this generation, and she in every way was a leading figure in the Institute of Human Development and a pathbreaker in terms of the kind of data she collected, which made our project so special, because she believed in open-ended interviewing, and she was masterful in the way she collected those interviews, the way she did the interviews. So you could go back in time and actually come up with a code book and measure things that were never measured by her, which really is the special niche, the special feature of the project. We were able to really go beyond the kinds of data you might collect every single year or every 5 years. You could do that. And so I just wanted to stress what a pathbreaker she was. And in some ways, what regret I have that the Institute was organized as silos initially. And I really, in the 4 years, I was really 5 years, I was right on the campus there at the Institute. I couldn't do much in terms of understanding that archive. I was stuck with the Oakland study. And it was only when I kept going back that I began to really get to know her and to appreciate the real pioneering features of her contribution. So
that's great.
Yeah,
thanks. It's a little bit of the backstory, and and as we've also tried to really leverage the archives to and harness them, to sort of do something with them that she also hadn't intended to do with them. And
right.
And Glenn said, ours is a very contextual historical study. One of the things we most love and appreciate about it is just how much you see how the crossing of spaces matters, whether it's the movement across the US in the journey to California, whether it's about California as a state, whether it's about the Bay Area and about Berkeley, all these layers of context, and then history overarching it. All these layers of context really come to life in this book. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves.
But that's good.
So just briefly, so there are about 420 parents altogether in the beginning, 210 couples. all of whom had a child born in 1928 and 29. So again, as Glenn mentioned, the focal point was often on the child born in those years, but McFarland also had this commitment to understanding the parents. So we're able to actually trace the parents from their early origins until late life as a result. The parents are going to be born between 85 and 08. So this is again why we're calling them the 1900 generation, but we're also going to find that some of the folks born before 1900 are going to be a little different than the folks after 1900. And so we'll be able to also kind of look at that distinction, which will help us make some more nuanced observations about some of the differences among the people in this group. There'll be periodic data collection pretty regularly from 28 to 47, and then again in 69 and again in the early 80s. And as I said a moment ago, one of the key distinctions will be really around generation and cohort, but also gender. Clearly, the life scripts of men and women are very different at this time, but we're also going to see they're being reworked. Social class will be important to keep in mind. About 60% are going to be middle class and 40% from working class. And the social class contrast will be important, but so will, as Glenn showed in Children of the Great Depression, the degree of deprivation during the Depression, despite your social class membership. And so we're also going to be exploring some of that along the way. I actually think I'm close to finishing up. Let me just finish with a quote that we love, and we open the book with this and we give it more treatment there. I think we just want to share it with you today because we love this quote, and it so often served to inspire us and ground the work that we were doing. And the quote is, "We are unsettled to the very roots of our being. We have no precedents to guide us, no wisdom that wasn't made for a simpler age. We have changed our environment more quickly than we know how to change ourselves." And those words could have been written by any number of us in the Zoom call today, especially from our vantage point right now. And yet, you may be surprised to know the time and the place of this quote. The author is Walter Lippmann, and Walter Lippmann wrote these words in 1914 in a book called Drift and Mastery. Lippmann, not Whitman. Lippmann was himself a member of this generation. He wrote these words on the eve of World War I. But I think you can you'll see here how so much of what we're discussing in the book has to do with this essential problem. Again, that big theme I mentioned earlier about human change and human adaptation. So I will stop there, and we can just start a discussion with you, Elaine.
I found this book to be incredibly compelling. I only knew about the lives of my grandparents and their experience of the Depression and World War II through the memories of their children, my parents, which was very interesting to me. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what you thought the key findings were about the impact of the Depression on this grandparental generation. Great grandparents for younger people in our audience.
I can take that if you.
Sure. Why don't you get us started, please?
Okay. We followed the 1900 generation from the prosperous 20s through the economy's collapse during the 30s, followed by the economic boom of the war years, which was really unparalleled, the economic boom, and which carried into the post-war period. All of these momentous years of the 20th century, the Berkeley men emerged as less healthy emotionally than their wives, and their wives were gaining in health, becoming more assertive, more agenic, And a lot of this had to do with what I describe as the mandate, the breadwinner mandate that men had to deal with at that time. The expectation that they would and must support their family. They were caught in a no-win situation. An inability to support their family often led to intense feelings of shame and despair. To scenes like the one described by a visitor, a staff member, who came upon a situation where the husband had his head in his hands, grieving at the kitchen table, and his wife was just beside herself because she knew of no way to deal with the situation, to cope with it. An inability to support their family often led to intense feelings of shame and despair like this. And married women played a role of homemakers in this culture. Many of them did work. In fact, many of them during the Depression held jobs, half-time jobs, but whether they worked or not was more optional than it was for men. Men, it was obligatory, and they felt it. And we found men who, in one case, an immigrant from Greece decided to move down to the basement because he did not want to meet anybody. He was so embarrassed by his inability to support his family. Then you have people men who would go to their office every day pretending as if they had a job and go to an office room, an office that was empty, basically, and do this over and over again. So the profound effect of a no-win situation for the men dealing with a great deal of hardship was most significant here.
Mhm.
And I think when we came to a follow-up in 1969-70, we found that this was 40 couples who survived all of the time up to 69-70. The wives emerged as more agentic and resilient than their husbands. So husband and wife in the same household had very different outcomes, reflecting the kind of experiences they've lived through over those years. And I think, to my mind, that's one of the big stories of the book. The contrasting paths that husbands and wives followed across the years. Much change has occurred in this, thankfully, but it was something to do research like this and to have open-ended interviews with husbands and wives who are going through all of this. I wanted to mention another connection between the Great Depression and World War II. The men who had very little work during the Great Depression entered a situation where there was endless work, and they worked very long hours. And this was long days and long weeks, and many of them described by their wives as on the edge of breakdowns in terms of the worry and the stress and everything. So I think that contrast between depression and war is really something to think about. And it's one of the great uniqueness features of this study that we're able to follow people from boom and bust, from the depression, from the 20s, which were good years, when they married, and they look back on those great years and think they're very, very fine years in their lives. Then they hit the depression, and we see great challenges and misery for husbands and wives and families. And then you hit the war years, which brought back hope. And yet it was very, very tough for these families, because many times the men lost their oldest son in the war. And it came on top of the fact that they didn't have a job for so long, and they really just began to recover from that, and it hit them again, the loss of somebody who is very significant in their lives. So it's that boom bust cycle that we're able to capture here, and it really shows up at the very end of their life, because husbands and wives end up at different points in terms of emotional health and well-being. So,
yeah, I guess I would just add, Elaine, that so that we see the sort of pattern of women often being able to stretch their roles and stretch their lives in ways that are adaptive to the needs of the family, and men so often seem to be paralyzed when they can't deliver on the things that are expected of them.
right.
So there's so this is the kind of tension we see in a number of areas. I guess I would just add, Glenn was talking more about the men and women in the couples. The relentless decade of the Depression era really also had kind of ripple effects across the generations of the families, not just among the couples themselves. Real struggles over whether to help extended family members or how to help them. Feeling embarrassment and shame if you needed to ask for help, and feeling sometimes resentment, a reservation, and maybe resentment if you have to give it. And we especially see that tension in middle-class families. Working-class families are much more willing, even when they have very little, to help others in a much broader range of social relations in the process. And I think in the middle class, well, in the working class, 3 out of 4 families also hosted a parent or a child, and most stays with relatives were over 3 years. So it gives you a sense of just how much families also had to stretch, not just in fending for themselves and marshaling resources for their immediate family, but thinking about how this would have ripple effects in patterns of exchange across generations.
Mm-hmm. Just one question, one
really
issue that we didn't cover. The age of children mattered a lot in terms of the impact of the Depression years. The very young boys, preschool age, were the most damaged by the Depression years, by hardship, by fathers who were out of control and angry and took it out often on their sons rather than daughters who were protected more by their mothers. I compared the Berkeley kids who were born in 28, 29 with the Oakland boys and girls who were born in 2021. So it's 9 years difference, and made the world of difference. In children of the Great Depression, these older children, and especially the males, did very well through this whole period. And the men went into World War II, 91% of them did. So they're members of the greatest generation, we so-called now, we call them that. And their wives flourished. They got the GI Bill and all of the advantages there. The children who were members of the Berkeley group sample, the boys were damaged badly, and yet I think what we find is that a single change is not a life. And they go through the depression years and they're badly injured and damaged by that experience. The war years are awful for them, but 6% of them go into the Korean War, and they come out as different people, really, much more assertive, much more in control of their lives, and in many ways very parallel, very a good match for the Oakland boys, who seem to have everything going their way. The Berkeley kids, the Berkeley men, recovered from that whole experience because the war years gave them a sense of confidence and direction in life and education. They went through and picked up education afterward. So they became different people as a result. And being able to do that, to see that, simply reminded me that we can't put all our marbles in one change. We need to really think that we're dealing with a life here, and the reverses in one period of their life can be changed around later on in life. And that's one thing we can see in the 1900 generation.
My parents, who were born 1915 and 1918, called World War II the best years of their lives.
Yeah.
In the meaning of the famous film,
Yes.
which is really what it means in the name of that film. The
Yes,
war
it
was the best years of their lives.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all of these hardships and impacts on views about the self, I mean, they must have, had profound impacts on health and well-being, even into later life. Can you comment on your findings about that?
Well,
Sure.
I think, go ahead.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, I think the Berkeley men end up very small number of them survive into old age. In the 60s, a good example is to take one segment of the sample, the lower middle class, where I think the men were under the greatest pressure because their wives didn't want to lose the middle class station in life. And there was a great deal of friction between husband and wife. The men who had to deal with all of this hardship end up not present at all in our sample in 1969. They're just, the males have the mortality basically eliminated the partners of the women. And so they end up pretty much by themselves, remarrying, most of them on their own, and very self-reliant, very much on their own and running their own life. And they describe their life as saying, I'm going to control my life now. And control is a big issue for them because they lived in a world which was out of control in many ways, and they dealt with the consequences. Now that many of them are still working in their 70s and 80s, we had women in our interviews who are working full-time at 75, and talking about how important it was, how gratifying it was to be able to be in control of their life situation.
Yeah, I could also add, this is Some of you may know the book that Eric Erickson wrote with his wife and also Helen Kivnick, called Vital Involvement in Old Age, I think. This is that group. I mean, grandparenting in the later years becomes a really significant source of meaning for them. And so do the other social relationships that many of these, largely women in late life, have. Friends and relationships with kids become such important sources of social meaning, and it's going to be especially true of those who knew extreme deprivation and hardship earlier in life. The power of social ties as protective and as coming with deep meaning. The women also look back from the vantage point of late life, and the ones with college education speak about how important schooling was and how important access to higher education was for their paths into the later years. And those who didn't go to college or have some other training after high school really kind of have regrets. They mourn the loss of the fact that they didn't have education and that additional training. And I think this is also where life in a community that has the university as its hub makes them keenly aware of their difference and of that sense of loss and having let it go. But Elaine, unlike your, was it who was it that you said was born in 1915?
My dad.
Your dad.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess unlike them, so this is a group of people who look back on the Depression decade as being the best and the worst of times. It has this duality of experience. So that's the decade that uniformly gets recalled as being the hardest, but it also has this kind of positive edge to it, because it's a time when they're building families and there are some pleasures that come with that. But hard times are also pulling families apart. But it's really the decade of the 20s that gets recalled in particular as the most satisfying years of marriage for both wives and husbands. And in part because this is a period of early family formation. It's also a time even before family formation. But it's a time that's also before the Depression hits, and it's still sort of that period after World War I. And there's this period of prosperity. It's a time they really look back on in the most positive of terms, especially in terms of the marriage, which peaks in the early years in terms of satisfaction.
So, I mean, it's, I think the changes in gender roles to me are fascinating. And I'd like to ask a question, and those of you who are in the audience, we're going to transition into questions and answers. At this point, you can add questions to our discussion, but it seemed to me that that the women of this generation were at the forefront of what's been an expanding shift in gender roles that continues to this day, and which is still having impact on all of us. Could you comment on that? Well, what was their impact on their daughters? What's been their impact on their granddaughters?
Yeah, I've done some work on that, and it's very interesting. Their mothers, where you can see the mothers trying to break loose of this notion that the sole role of women is to maintain the household, to care for the household, homemaking. You could see this in the war years, and I think the daughters were aspired to a broader life, but then they hit the post-war years when all these men were coming back from the service, and I think that made a difference. That changed the world in which women were living, and so this desire to have a life beyond simply home homemaking changed. If you were going to get married, and many of them did right after the war, they met the troop ships coming home. The parents had a lot of trouble keeping the girls away from the ports because it was a very exciting time. Everyone felt exhilarated by the way the war was turning out. And some of the families actually entertained the boys, invited them to their home for refreshments and all kinds of conversation and meeting people. And so I think that turned around the direction they might have felt, but especially this getting on with life. The boys come home and they want to get on with life, have families and so on. So you see that happening. I saw it in children of the Great Depression. There was this period of domesticity right after the war. And
I guess,
yeah.
but if I could just quickly add, this is where the fast path to adulthood emerges after the war, and so what you see in the lives of the daughters here is a path that in some ways starts to reverse what their own mothers were trying to create.
Right, yeah.
And we were surprised at actually how at the fact that for many of these people, like the national median of the age of marriage was about 25 for men this time, and 22 for women. And women talk about a waiting period between schooling and marriage. I mean, it's a slower clock.
Yeah.
And then the fast path starts in the war, and that gets reflected in the generation of the daughters and the sons.
Yeah.
And so there is a tension. There are tensions also about what education is good for in the lives of women.
I must say that the fathers were not very encouraging of their daughters. Many of them said, my daughter's just going to get married. Why should she go on to college, And so there was a lot of that. I think the mothers, the wives of these men wanted much more than that. You could see they were striving for a broader, bigger life than
they really are they are redefining marriage as more companionate.
Yes, they are.
This is the group of women who are forcing more companionate marriages, forcing their husbands to be better in communication in the emotion realm. They're seeing parenthood as being more science-driven. They're seeing, even if they're not, once they've begun having children, aren't as likely to be working, they do also see civic involvement is very valuable. So they are stretching the roles for women, despite the fact that for most of them, once they become mothers, they leave work behind unless it becomes necessary for the good of the family.
Yeah. We have some raised hands. I can't activate them, but Janice can. So one question is from Steve H, and I think I know who that is.
Yes, you do. This is my own virtual return from San Diego. So hello to friends and colleagues, especially to Glenn, who is not only a colleague but my next door neighbor.
Oh, Steve, my goodness.
You've actually just gotten into the issue that I was curious about, which is, you've described this generation of what we might call liberated women, who then were followed by another generation whose daughters wanted to be liberated, and I had not been aware of that. I knew something about Rick's, point about the age at marriage and the fast track to adulthood, because in my generation, what we have dealt with is the expectation that you graduate from high school and then you either go to college or you go to work and you have a family, and that's what happened in my generation. But that was really anomalous, and it's hard for people in my generation to understand that. So it's both of those things: the speed of the transition and what happened to the women.
Right. One thing we need to add here is the GI Bill after the war that transformed really the country, because so many men went on to college, got great jobs, were encouraged to go on to training and so on. It just really changed the future of this generation. What goes with this, though, are the wives who manage the home front. In many ways, the men wanted a life away from all of the danger and the worry that they had gone through, and the frustration and all of that. And so you have men and women going on different paths here, I think, but we can't forget the tremendous impact of the GI Bill. It just transformed this country, really.
And I guess I would say it's not just the transformation of women's roles, but it's men too. These are men who, again, the 1920s bring an era of science devoted to the study of the child. This is when, like, the science of child development starts. This is when SRCD pinpointed its origin, 1922. The 20s see the sudden focus on trying to study children in their own right, and to conduct science in ways that foster not just the development of the child, but also the development of the parents and their roles. And we see men wanting to become, better fathers. We see men wanting to become better spouses. Men are struggling also with this increasing separation of work as a place that you go to. Commuting emerges. I mean, and they're feeling the weight of this, the sense that for husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, that this increasing separation of these spheres of life can create a tendency to grow apart. And they're trying to figure out how in living in these new ways are they also going to foster their own growth as a couple and in their own roles as parents and spouses.
It's 12:57. It's books. Yeah. It's book raffle.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Quickly, I'll bring myself on screen real quickly, and we'll just do the book raffle, and then we can continue going with questions. I know there's a few more. So what Sarah has created is this, well, you'll see. It's all of you who are in the room are currently eligible for the free book. So Sarah, turning it over to you.
All right, hang on. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to get the wheel of names going. All right.
You can see the book in the middle.
Love this.
Okay.
Well, that's one way to do it.
Good. Yeah, I love it.
All right. Oh, congratulations.
This could be a fundraiser, you realize, for BCTR. Managed, you got the right license.
All right, so Jan, we'll be in touch with you about getting you your book, and I'm turning it back. We're going back off screen and back over to questions. And I know, Elaine, I sent you one in chat, and there's another raised hand after that.
There's a question in chat that I have up, and hello to the questioner. It's been a long time. The question is, what disparities did you find among the BIPOC population, people of color, given all of the policy issues that supported white citizens? For example, the GI Bill, housing and loans, things like that.
Yeah. My goodness, that's a big question.
It is.
Yeah, really huge. And the problem is you are struck by the demarcation of populations that we really don't. You see, for example, the GI Bill, the African-American returning soldiers didn't have access to that. And it's, yeah, it's very powerful. It's really a society that we look now at this world and we think, I never realized it was that way, you know, when we were growing up. And so it's a recognition of all of that that's really weighty now.
I guess we could
you can't
also
make changes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hey, Glenn.
Yeah.
I guess we could also add, you know, this is a white sample. It's reflective of the composition of California at the time, more or less, and of the city of Berkeley. In
the 20s, in the 20s.
Yeah, but you know, I think it's what happens in wartime that for me brings so much insight into the kinds of struggles that we see in our continue to see in our world today, and that's that the whole composition of the population and the community starts to change. That wartime brings a huge influx of poor Southerners in particular into the Bay Area to work in the shipyards in particular. And so you have both the sudden influx of poor whites and you have the influx of poor blacks. And then you also have increasing concerns about the Japanese who are in the Bay Area, of course, in the middle of the war, and you have concern about Germans and some, to a lesser degree, Germans and Italians. But the you know, war, in being confronted with war, and in this place, living amid war, being in the presence of danger, of blackouts, of bomb threats, fear is in the air. They're all talking about that. Overcrowded neighborhoods and crime and delinquency and squalor and noise and the presence of these strangers that kind of potentially threaten life and the community as they knew it. And it's sort of there that in that period that these kinds of issues that we struggle with today really emerge for these families, including the fact that they have to talk about war with their kids in deep and intimate ways, and the Japanese who are very much there in their community and who are business owners and gardeners and even friends. Of course, suddenly with the internment, kids and families are swept up and out, and many of them go to Tule Lake here in Oregon at the border between California and Oregon. They have to talk about the fact that these people have suddenly vanished, and so you know, and why is that? And so I think for us, this is such a profound area to understand what the changing racial, ethnic, and economic composition of a community means.
Okay, are there additional questions?
Looks like Steve Hamilton. I don't know, Steve, your hand is still up. Do you have another question?
Well, I
No,
can
I-
ask Steve a question. I think San Diego is warmer than Ann Arbor.
Yeah, you're right about that. That's definitely one of the attractions, but there are three granddaughters here that are even more important attraction.
including Lainey, right? Lainey's there.
Laney's up in Oregon, yes.
Oh, okay.
Well, last call for questions. I feel like we have a little bit more time if you want to.
We're happy to stay a few more minutes.
Sure.
I'll just note that this has been fascinating. I did my undergraduate thesis on the women's self-help movement, and I knew so the gender story, the gender narrative that you're tracing is something I'm fascinated by, and I certainly see in the 21st century, and I certainly see in my mental health work here at this point in my life. I didn't realize, and I knew that it had started in the women's self-help movement, the issues around reproductive and sexual health, but I hadn't realized it was quite so profoundly visible in a way that you picked up in your research across the 20th century. So I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I guess the question would be, do you see this arc of some of the gender differences and struggles that we're noticing now being a continuation of something that really started to show up in the 20th century?
I can comment on that because I was, before I was a graduate student in sociology, I was a graduate student in history, actually here at the University of Michigan. And I eventually transferred into sociology because of my interest, but the equivalent of my master's projects was looking at young women's labor force participation from 1880 to 1920 and how it was portrayed in the media and in magazines. And a friend of mine who was in the psych department at that time did a parallel study of actual labor force participation. And there's actually a steady increase by decade in women's labor force participation across the 20th century, growing from the increase in the 1890s. And prior to World War II and World War I, women were not only in the United States, but in England, were in war work. And they were heroines in magazines. They were portrayed as heroines in magazines for participating like that. So it may even go back even a little further. So,
well, of course, Elaine, those are great points, and we were actually surprised by that, to see just how many working class women had actually, some of them, a subgroup, pretty continuous work histories. They were there working, and again, because their family had those needs, it's this narrative that that women's, more regular work begins in World War II is of course partly true, but we were surprised to see just how many women had histories of work in this particular generation, and again, especially in the working class. And from the vantage point today of COVID, I think we have to really worry about this, the signaling of a shift in women's continued labor force participation over the century, because amid COVID, we know that so many adult women are leaving the workforce to care for preschool kids, and to help their school-age kids negotiate distance learning. So, I think there are worries about right now, what is this pandemic and everything we've been through potentially mean for that longer trend you're talking about. Yeah.
I think one of the things that really comes through is how prevalent work before marriage was. I mean, that you can see it happening. We're going out, getting a job, and working, and this can be before school or in place of going on to higher education or training schools or whatever. But in the 20s, a large percentage of the women were working before they got married. And Lisa, really, she's not here, but she really did a terrific job of focusing on working during the war years, working in the 20s, the early years, and how all of this ties into marriage at that time. I think one of the things that was very surprising to me was what a treasure Jean McFarland's archive that she developed on women and men during the 20s. You really, great measures of marriage. I remember Ernest Burgess's work at Chicago in 1934, but it was a survey, And G. McFarland followed these people across time, interviewing them about marriage. I mean, it's really amazing. It was amazing to me to see the quality of work, quality of data collection at that time, and the insights in the really it was understated because she never published much of this. One of the things I didn't mention is that she collected all of this data, and I don't think you'll find much out there published by her from the parents. She focused on the kids.
Mhm.
And so when I encountered this archive at the Institute, it was basically unused, and there was hardly any track in the data archive of people who had worked with the material before and used it to do what we've done in this. I guess they would use it. She was very interested in case analytic approach to children. And that's one reason she did such thorough interviews of the whole family members, father, the mother, you really get a picture of the family as a unit. But she never really did very much at all with the parents. And so it was a wonderful gold mine to run into. I was so surprised. I was surprised because the Berkeley or the Oakland study had none of this to speak of. It was the children only. And you really got very little information on the parents. You really could not say very much about them at all. So, yeah.
Such a treasure trove. Thank you all. I want to be able to, I
Okay.
want to, yeah, close this up now. I really, really appreciate you taking time to present for us, as well as all the attendees, especially those who stuck around for the questions to participate. And I know there'll be more opportunities to learn, and I encourage everybody to read Dr. Elder and Settersten's wonderful book. And Elaine, thank you so much for being the facilitator here.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you all.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank
All
you
right,
so
everyone.
much.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Have a
Okay.
good weekend.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Elaine.
Bye-bye. So
Yeah,
good to see you.
Good to see you.
Bye, and bye to Steve.
Right. Yeah.